Good morning. I'm Mark Lewis, the Executive Director of the Emerging Technologies Institute at the National Defense Industrial Association. And thank you to all of our attendees and panelists for participating with NDIA and with ETI. Especially thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the state of the space industrial base. Let me begin by expressing deep appreciation to our sponsor, Synopsys. Synopsys is a proud NDIA member, a leader in electronic design automation tools, intellectual property, and DMEA accredited services for aerospace, defense, government customers. Synopsys is excited to sponsor NDIA's State of the Space Industrial Base webinar and looks forward to partnering with each of you to exceed mission requirements on your next space program. This event is an NDIA Space Division and ETI webinar featuring the Defense Innovation Unit's recent State of the Space Industrial Base 2022 report. This report highlights critical steps the United States must take to maintain its leadership position in space vis-a-vis China. And we're going to be having a robust discussion with the DIU leadership, and then some comments from industry panelists reflecting on the report and what the implications are. Of the many steps required, one of the most crucial is the need to accelerate strengthening the space industrial base. Today's webinar will include those two panels which will cover this. During the first, we'll hear from authors of the report, provide an in-depth look at key issues covered in the report that are most important to the space industrial base. And then we're going to have a second panel, which we'll hear from industry experts who will provide their perspectives on the health of the space industrial base, analyze how the government and industry can work together to promote innovation, strengthen the sector, and ensure that the U.S. is the technological leader in this critical area. Following the webinar, ETI will publish a white paper that summarizes some of the key points from today's discussion, and the white paper will be available on our website. Before we go any further, I want to thank Marty Whalen and the rest of the Space Division for all their work in organizing and planning today's webinar, as well as the staff of the Emerging Technologies Institute. So let me begin also with some administrative remarks before we get started. First, all online attendee lines are muted. Sorry about that. But if you have a question during the webinar, you can submit your question in the Q&A box. We will do our best to get through all the questions during the Q&A, no guarantees. Members of the press, you're welcome to submit questions, of course. Please, though, do identify yourself with your name and organization in the question itself. We're recording today's webinar for members who are unable to attend, and for any member who wishes to review the material at a later date. It will be available within the next few days. We'll post that recording to our YouTube channel for your review. And with that, I'd like to introduce the distinguished moderator for our first panel, Janet Grundin. Janet is the CEO of Stellar Solutions, a small woman-owned business and a leading provider of high-impact engineering services to significant intelligence, defense, civil, commercial, and international customers for the past 27 years. Prior to becoming CEO, she served as the Vice President for Intelligence Programs, Vice President for Defense Programs, and Director of Emerging Space Capabilities. Janet's a former Northrop Grumman Director, retired United States Air Force Colonel with over 30 years of experience in navigation, remote sensing, satellite communications, launch, space superiority, and launch ranges. She received a Bachelor of Science in Aeronautical Engineering from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, a Master of Science in Aeronautical Engineering from the Air Force Institute of Technology, and a Master of Science in Strategic Studies from the Air War College, as well as Master of Science in Military Operational Art and Science from the Air Command and Staff College. Janet, thank you so much for moderating our first panel today, and over to you.
All right, Mark, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here this morning. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And to be in the presence of so many great Americans working in the space industry and pushing our needs forward. So first, we have three panelists today. I'm going to introduce Major General John Olson first, and then he's going to give some remarks, and then we'll introduce the other two panelists, and they'll give their remarks. So Major General John Olson is the Mobilization Assistant to the Chief of Space Operations at the Pentagon. General Olson is the Space Force lead for Joint All-Domain Command and Control and Advanced Battle Management System. As the first Chief Data and Artificial Intelligence Officer for the Department of the Air Force, he leads both Air Force and Space Force data and AI initiatives. General Olson also serves on the OSD Operational Energy Innovation Technical Advisory Group, and he flies as an Airborne Emergency Action Officer on the Looking Glass Airborne Nuclear Command Post. And I'm not going to turn it over to him until I get to brag a little bit more on him. He has 5 engineering degrees, which I'm pretty amazed about. He's a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School. He was a NASA Senior Executive Service Leader and he has industry experience over 9 years in public and private corporations, culminating as CEO. And finally, he served as the Assistant Director for Space and Aeronautics at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So, General Olson, looking forward to your remarks. Over to you, sir.
Well, good morning, Janet. I really appreciate the opportunity to address this very important topic. As we talk about the state of the space industrial base, nothing could be more critical to underpinning a set of activities in space that are absolutely key to our way of life in not only America, but across the globe. And so as we look at the core essence of space, it's critical to our success and our economic health and national security. And so that really underpins all of this important work. And I think as we look at the amalgam of inputs from over 250 industry participants in two different events, one in Florida and one in New Mexico, together as we've built, this is our fourth year of doing this, I can confidently say that the level of inputs and the vigor and the attention to detail and also the passion with which they were put forward was as strong as ever. And I think that really underscores the critical moment in time. As our president and commander-in-chief has said, this is the decisive decade for America, and I absolutely believe that's true in space. But as we look and reflect back on the core highlights of the State of the Space Industrial Base report, which we actually published in August of 2022. But as we look at the current state, the 250 plus inputs, all almost to a person, highlighted the strategic competition that is currently going on in space. And they said this is absolutely critical, absolutely important. But to succeed in that competition, to lead where the stakes are so high and where it permeates so many elements of the fabric of the United States, where it addresses our grand challenges of the economy, security, jobs, the environment, healthcare. All these things can be linked and tied to and amplified by our efforts in space. One thing that is clear is they said we need a strategic vision. We need a strong vision, a North Star, if you will, that ties all this together, because it's an important guidepost to make sure that we are not just competitive, but we're strategically leading and doing so across the whole of nation approach. And this is really important because it's got to bring together our interagency elements across the government. It's got to bring together our institutional elements across the non-governmental organizations and trade groups and industry groups. But most importantly, the industry side is what underpins this. And of course, with the State of the Space Industrial Base report, that's really what it's all about, tying those in, large, medium, and small, new and old, traditional and non-traditional, whatever descriptor you could use for the industrial base, that is a key enabler. And of course, it's also bolstered by academia or institutional elements. And then finally, the international spectrum, tying in our partners and allies, since that's a key part of it. But I'll focus on back to this North Star vision. They said, hey, we need a North Star vision. We understand we have the United States Space Priorities Framework, which was put out by the National Space Council in December of 2021. We know we have lots of language coming from our national space policy and from the National Defense Strategy and the National Security Strategy. And indeed, that's all true. They said that's necessary, but not sufficient. We need something that brings that into a much more cohesive, enduring North Star vision for America. And that's got to be inclusive of all those elements across the spectrum of commercial, civil, and national security space activities. And so really what they proffered to us for consideration is their recommendation was economic development and human settlement as the vision to not just retain, but advance U.S. economic leadership, motivate our American populace, and protect our U.S. national interest, and also do so in an enlightened, inclusive way with our partners and allies that are like-minded. We've seen some of this in the Artemis Accords, and of course, they continue to gain additional members. But this is a broader view, and they actually outline for that North Star vision that this needed to be something that was equally owned by the National Security Council at the White House, the National Space Council, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy, or OSTP. And so that's really the core of the primary thrust and the overarching mandate, if you will, from all the participants. And I think as we look at the broader context of that, really it's a reflection of the fact that commercial space technology has forever changed, not just the civil and commercial community, but we've seen that this year ever more so. It's changed the nature of conflict as we look at the unprovoked and unjustified Russian invasion of Ukraine. What we've seen is the David and Goliath leveler there like never before. Certainly it's a kinetic war of attrition, but it's the first war of cognition. And I can confidently say that as you look at the impact that commercial space industry has had in transforming, in creating a tremendous value added capacity there, just in Maxar and Capella and Starlink alone, those three companies as symbols of the broad spectrum of inputs, it has truly been transformative. And so this is going to be key as we look at this hybrid space architecture driving forward that has government and civil and commercial as a deep integral part of that. And it's both physical and it's digital. And this is going to be key, as all the participants outlined, to sustaining and extending our U.S. leadership in space. And this also ties to research, to development, to operations, and it must endure, and that is for the long term. And so that's really from an opening context and an opening perspective, perhaps the most important, most fervent level of inputs that we got from those participants.
All right. Well, thank you, General Olson. Appreciate those opening remarks. And the Q&A is open for anybody that wants to propose some questions. Feel free. Our next panelist, Steve Bucky Buteau, is the director of the space portfolio at the Defense Innovation Unit. He is an early plank holder, I think, as many of us know, and helped establish the operating locations in Silicon Valley, Boston, and Austin, Texas. General Buteau is also serving as commander of the California Air National Guard, where he leads 4,900 airmen assigned to 5 wings and a headquarters staff. So General Buteau is a former commander of the 129th Rescue Wing at Moffett Airfield in California. And he was served as Chief of Personnel Recovery for U.S. Air Force's Central in 2007, supporting Operations Iraqi and Enduring Freedom. General Buteau has more than 3,500 flying hours in T-37, T-38, and various versions of the C-130. Also, as a researcher with the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, the SETI Institute, Bucky worked on instrument concepts for Mars surface soil analysis at the Ames Research Center, and he was recognized for many of his outstanding achievements and contributions with several awards, including the Ames Honor Award as a member of the Astrobiology Mission Project Team in 2000. So really happy to have you on the panel today, Bucky. Thank you for joining us. Over to you for your opening comments.
Well, thank you. The report, and of course, we do this report every year, and we look at it as kind of a status check or a health check, an annual exam of the industrial base, and see how it's doing in terms of our long-term visions that General Olson referred to, and without question, what we really want is we want a strong commercial space industrial base that supports not just the military and the national security and defense aspects, but our economic security, and also is a vibrant part of our exploration efforts with NASA. So the commercial capabilities really transcend all. And when we look at the ecosystem as a whole, we look at different parts. You know, myself and Colonel Felt in his prior role, the mission of DIU is to really do robust prototyping, experimentation, and validation of capabilities. And I think that is an area where space is traditionally been underfunded. It's getting better, but if we want to have robust capabilities that are really coupled to the state of art of technology, we really need to make sure that we're investing properly in the research and development area to include the prototyping activities that we do with commercial companies, new and old, that are doing really interesting things to give us that competitive advantage in space. After that, you know, the next thing is meaningful contracts. You know, there's a lot of discussion about this, but you know, it's great to have a commercial capability. We will eventually on this program talk about the Valley of Death, but a great way to bridge that is that we put our money into buying what we can and only building what we must. So the meaningful contracts which are very important, extends into not just procurement of widgets, but services. Services contracts are not something that's normally done in the Department of Defense, but most all the interesting things commercially that are going to be offered in space are going to be available as commercial services. And we really need the U.S. Space Force to be the executive agent for the entire department to make a wide variety of services available. And that's a great way to keep a competition in our economic base and give the Department of Defense the ability to pivot rapidly to new and emerging technology that's better than maybe what we subscribed to last year. We can't have a discussion about space without talking about China, and it's noteworthy to add that China had 50 space launches last year and celebrated a 100% success rate. They are getting better in space, and so we're not just talking about the competitive environment from companies within the United States or companies between the United States and our allies. China is a real competitor in the space area, and they're very ambitious. They put out new plans, and I think that's great, frankly, because we want a competitive, peaceful environment where all of our nations can come together. But we need to make sure that what we're not doing is we're not putting our own economic system at a disadvantage because we're tightly coupled to policies that were written in 1962. The workforce. This year's report was the first time we looked seriously at the workforce, and we've noted that if we grow at the rate of growth that we're anticipating, we're going to be severely underscoped in terms of engineering talent, the science talent that is going to be needed to fill really good jobs in the future. And so it's important that what we do is we need to give a shot in the arm for STEM education. We need to improve the interaction between our companies and our communities and get people excited about space. I'm a huge fan of NASA. Obviously, I used to work there, but the Artemis program, for everything that people say about it, the one thing that Artemis program did just literally a month ago is it gave a shot in the arm of the American people. The moon is not that far away anymore, and the incredible pictures and the success of that program has got people excited. We have to harness that excitement, and we need to start in our schools. And I know NDIA is a great proponent of this, but we have to put that in overdrive. China is crushing us in terms of the production of engineers and scientists and STEM students, and we have to work hard to be competitive in that environment. And finally, on finance, there's a lot of consternation about the financial sector. Our financial sector is actually pretty strong. One of our companies that we've been working with for a while, in their state of transition with the department right now in the commercial imagery, just closed a $60 million series raise just last week, and so money is available. It's going to be a lot more. It's going to be a lot harder to get money, but that's on purpose, because the investors want to see good companies with good records of performance. But we also have to be careful that we don't just keep asking investors to invest, and we don't transition capabilities into meaningful contracts. So I'm very, very excited to be working in support of Colonel Felt and Frank Calvelli I think we're going to see a tremendous boost in the type of acquisitions that the department needs to stay relevant in the future. So I'll pause right there. Because I know we're going to get some really good questions, and I'm going to turn it back for the next speaker.
Great. Thank you, Bucky. Those are great comments, and I look forward to hearing more about those topics as we get into the Q&A. Our next panelist is Colonel Eric Felt. He is the Director of Architecture and Integration in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Space Acquisition and Integration at the Pentagon. He leads a team of 25 military and on-site contractors responsible for developing and integrating the Department of Defense, Department of the Air Force, and United States Space Force space architectures. His organization focuses on optimizing the Space Force's $15 billion portfolio of resilient capabilities, including communications, position, navigation, and timing, remote sensing, space access, mobility and logistics, and space control. So Colonel Felt has earned a Master's of Science and a doctorate degree in electrical engineering from UC Berkeley, which is no small task. He is also, like General Olson, a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School. He served as a developmental engineer, program manager. He served in test organizations, program office, and staff assignments. And prior to this current position, he was commander and director of the Air Force Research Lab Space Vehicles Directorate at Kirtland Air Force Base, New Mexico. Eric, welcome, and over to you for your comments.
Thank you, Janet. Great to be here this morning. I did recently transition from the Air Force Research Lab role, where we facilitated this conference and wrote the report, into this the office in the Pentagon, SAF-SQ we call it, which is the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Space Acquisition and Integration, the Honorable Frank Calvelli. And one of the things that was most interesting is that I kind of thought I was gonna set aside this industrial based stuff and this interesting report and now go work on space acquisition. But these things are intimately linked, and the things that we do in space acquisition can be super helpful to our industrial base or super harmful to our industrial base. And so this report and the ideas that we get from industry are very important to my boss and to what we're trying to do in the Pentagon to make sure we harness the power of U.S. innovation and the industrial base that we're seeing right now, especially in this space sector. So what I wanted to do this morning in my introductory remarks here is talk about some of Honorable Calvelli's 9 tenets for space acquisition that he put out at the end of October, and specifically how those are going to help us fulfill the recommendations and the frustrations that are expressed in the report. So his tenets for acquisition had 3 goals. First, speed, so we can do things faster. Second, resiliency, so we can get after the threats and make sure our space capabilities are there when we need them the most. And integration into the joint warfight. So of particular interest today, let's talk about speed. He's been extremely focused on the need for our space acquisition systems to go faster. One of the reasons that that's so important is that will better synchronize with the emerging industrial base and the emerging space capabilities that are out there. And the more important reason is that will get new important space capabilities into the hands of our warfighters sooner. So he's talked a lot about the need to go faster, and he recently put out a formula for how to go faster. And really, this is not going to be anything super complex or complicated, but these are things that we really need to think about and that we are getting after. So his formula for going faster in space acquisition starts with smaller systems. You just cannot build a huge satellite quickly, but you can build smaller satellites quickly, and you can buy commercial goods and services quickly. And so if you want to have smaller systems, that is a key enabler to going faster in space acquisition. The one recommendation that's in this report that is directed to the DoD is buy more commercial systems. That is important because, again, there's all these new capabilities that are coming along. Some of them are very useful to us, and we want to buy those that are useful, and then that sends the right signal to industry as to what our value function is, and then they can respond much faster than the government can to help fulfill our future needs and make sure we maintain a technology edge against China. So the first part of the formula for going faster is to build smaller systems, and that includes buying more commercial systems, which is perfectly aligned with what's in the report. That's how the hybrid space architecture includes commercial as an integral element of all of our space architectures for that exact reason. Helps us innovate faster, helps us be more resilient, helps us harness the power of our U.S. commercial industrial base. So that is a big thrust of what we're doing. The second element that Honorable Calvelli talked about in terms of going faster was to have lower NRE. And what he means by that is he does not want our space acquisition programs off developing a bunch of new technology. He wants the labs and industry through IRAD and startups and commercial innovation to be doing the tech development work. And then the programs just harness that technology and bring it in to the program so that the program does not have to spend a lot on NRE. We must maintain our technology advantage over China. So that's not a statement that we don't want to do new stuff. We do not want to do risky new stuff as part of the programs, is what he means by that when he says low NRE. So that's great. That is more opportunities for new technology to be ingested into our space capabilities and our space systems on a more recurring basis if the programs are not committing to what they need 10 years ahead of time and then doing it all themselves. That will open up the ecosystem to many more players on the science and technology and the innovation front, because the programs will be out shopping at a wider marketplace for what technologies they need when they start up. So lowering NRE of the programs of record opens up the tech work to a much wider base, and that should be very helpful. So that's the second element of the recipe for going faster. The third element of the recipe for going faster is 3 years ATP to launch. So this is a little bit tied into the first two, and then if you have smaller systems and they're not as much development needed, then you can get to launch much faster. This is a big change from the systems that we've built in the past that sometimes take 7, 10, 13 years to get from ATP to launch. But this is absolutely essential if we want to be able to outcompete China and bring new technology to our warfighters faster. So he laid that line in the sand. He says, hey, 3 years ATP to launch. You set up your program so that you can do that. And then you will have some spiral development, or like we're doing at the Space Development Agency, where every tranche rolls out a new layer of capability. Each one builds upon the past. That model gets warfighting capability into the hands of the warfighter much faster, and rather than it's not perfect at first, but it evolves over time in a good way. And that provides opportunities to ingest new capabilities and new technologies at each of these spirals that we don't have in the past. So rather than, for example, with one of our big programs of the past, if GPS, for example, has a plan for the next 15 years and there's no opportunity to do anything different, that doesn't allow us to provide the agility and innovation that we might need to counter China. Instead, if we have smaller spirals of capability that are being developed and launched every 3 years, that provides more opportunities to bridge the valley of death and pick up more technologies that are going to be in there. So that's the third thing. 3 years ATP to launch. He drew that line in the sand, and the PEOs are off figuring out how to implement that. And finally, the fourth element of Honorable Calvelli's recipe for going faster is to use more firm fixed price contracts. It's not always the right or best contract choice, but if you've reduced the risk of the development and you're building a smaller system that's easier to scope out up front, then FFP is a great contract choice for most of what we're doing. He's talking about that in order to drive discipline into the process, so that when we commit up front that we're going to build a satellite for a certain price or capability for a certain price, that we do that, and that we have that kind of discipline. It opens up the market to new vendors that sometimes don't want to or aren't able to compete for our cost plus contracts. And really, it opens up the opportunity for industry to make higher profit margins by taking more risk when you're dealing with more FFP contracts. All that's intentional. We want to reward industry for good, useful ideas that they can bring to our Space Force, and that's part of what the focus on the FFP contracts is all about. So it's really, like I said, there's nothing cosmic or new in here, but I thought it was great to, after we came out with this report and understood the frustrations that industry were feeling in some of these areas, to have the assistant secretary lay out very clearly for the PEOs what his expectations are, and that this is how we're going to get after some of those frustrations and some of the things in the report. So all you have to do to go faster, build smaller systems, low NRE, 3 years to launch, and use more FFP contracts. And of course, that's a simplification, but moving in that direction, I think, will be very healthy for the Space Force and healthy for industry as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, those are exciting initiatives, I think, out of the Honorable Calvelli there. So we did get a couple of questions, and I'm going to start with one from Chris Prodzik. So and maybe tailor it just slightly to your comments, Colonel Felt. He's asking about the U.S. bureaucracy and it's falling short of implementing the space strategy. I might tailor that slightly to ask, all the 4 items that you just said that you're focused on, those are all things that the Space Force can do with current authorities. What does the Space Force need in terms of bureaucracy? What changes, like changes to the PPB system, changes to some other part of bureaucracy to really, get that capability out faster? You can control some things, but what is it outside of your control that you need fixed in the bureaucracy?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And one of the things we've learned in the Assistant Secretary's office is that we actually can have a lot of authorities to do the things that we're talking about and know that we need to do without big changes to the law or the processes. So that's where our focus has been, is maximizing the speed and agility that we can get out of the things that we can control. And that we can actually do a lot just with that approach. After we're successful with that, I do think we're going to reach the point where the acquisition process is not the slow part that is keeping us from beating China. The acquisition part is going to be lean and nimble, and you're going to look to other things such as the requirements process, PPB process, that are going to be the limiting factors in how fast we can go. And there are people looking at those processes too to figure out how to streamline them. So if we can get all of this streamlined together, I think we can build a very powerful, machine and capability for quickly innovating and maintaining our technology edge. So I do think we will eventually need some bigger changes, but for now there's a lot we can do just with the authorities that we have on the acquisition side, and that's where our focus has been. I don't think we know yet exactly what those changes should look like. We know that there's going to be needed reforms in those other areas. And there's committees off working on that and looking at those other things. But I think the key thing will be for us to come together with this vision of, hey, we want to be faster and more nimble so that we can respond to the threats. And if we all are focused on that and what we need to counter China, then I think we'll be able to come up with some good solutions. But we can do a lot without big reform.
Janet, I might follow that up. Oh, I might follow that up as well. And Bucky, I know you'll have some good thoughts there. I mean, it is an excellent question, and it is one that a lot of talk and discussion on. As we look at Lieutenant General Gutlein, our Space Systems Command Director for the Space Force, largely encompassing many of the operational application and implementation of the acquisition side, we've adopted a policy of exploit what we have, buy what we can, and only build what we must. And I think that simply and effectively implements, leverages that which is within our control, driving creativity, driving that innovation within the operations and the applications, and it distills and it takes the excellent guidance that Honorable Calvelli and and Eric just nicely synopsized, and it puts that into practice. But I think there's some larger structural, issues that for years we've been talking about the stability of funding and the timeliness of funding coming out of the Congress that's so very important. I think that's ever more true when we look at the National Defense Authorization Act. That is essential to drive timely and effective phased competitive action by the United States and our partners and allies against or vis-a-vis a command-driven, civil military fusion-driven paradigm for our pacing competitors and challengers. And similarly, we also, I think many have fairly criticized space, but more broadly, the department in terms of overclassification, and that being a challenge to bringing in new industry partners, to bringing in our international partners and allies and like-minded thinkers. And so I think we're working that in earnest. Former Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Hyten, really tackled that, and at his retirement he said, I didn't achieve full success there. I didn't achieve the level that he wanted. So that's a really tough, hairy problem, but is an imperative one as well. And I think the last one is that requirement systems. Of the big three that are squarely big macro issues, the requirement system, in my role as the Department of the Air Force Chief Data and AI Officer, I can tell you that having access to our authoritative data and leveraging tools that incorporate that ready data analytics and the big data platforms and pulling in AI and ML and deep learning capabilities, that's allowing us to take some of these PPB exercises that used to be Red Bull filled 3-week, with our best and brightest minds working around the clock, to now what used to take 3 weeks can now take a matter of minutes. And so that has been an extraordinary enabler. It's how we're being tech enabled, harnessing that for good, but we still got a lot more way to go. But I think when we start looking at that on our mega initiatives on the people side, on the operations side, and the funding and the basing and the logistics side, well, that the nexus of that work is extraordinarily beneficial, and it's unleashing the true power of our people and capabilities and systems. So that's how we're getting after it today. But these still are macro issues, and I think the panel looking at there's several studies going on. I think those are all relevant and really important. But these are how we're getting after some of these macro issues right now. And I know Bucky will have some good follow-ups.
Yeah. So all of our activities in space is really a whole of government activity, and I think it's important. The Department of Defense has already gone through the AA program and sorted out what do we need to fix, and we're well on our way to getting healthy. But I'm telling you, if you look at last year, I mean, we did double the number of space launches than we did 5 years ago, and yet if you go into a lot of the institutions across government, the FCC, FAA, there's the same number of people processing a huge number of applications. And I'll tell you the consequence of this is we've had a number of commercial startup companies who literally have had their payloads pulled off of launch vehicles at the last minute because they just didn't get their licensing in time. It's happened to Eric at AFRL. That's a systemic breakdown in the bureaucracy. And it's interesting because it's probably a little bit too early to say we need a Department of Space, but here's the reality. What we did address in the report is that the Office of Space Commerce, it reports to NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It doesn't even report to the Secretary of Commerce. And so what we need to do is we need to kind of do an overhaul across the government space to make us leaner, more agile. And we had a nice little piece in the report about finding a way to what can we do agile, policy evolution, or agile, licensing, do things so that we can keep the state of innovation moving and not shackled because they didn't, they haven't. There's not enough people to process the paperwork. So this is going to be a more substantial part of how we compete with China in the future, because they have a centrally managed economy, and there's no delay. So I think that's the Space Force, in my opinion, not being a part of it, it gets 5 stars, and in terms of what it's doing with the commercial sector, but it's a whole of government activity to be successful in this arena.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bucky and General Olson, Eric. Those are great comments. I think we could talk about that subject for a lot longer, but those are awesome insight. I'm going to turn, our conversation's we're going to have to wrap up in about 10 minutes. So the panel's kind of gone very quickly, in my opinion, but I want to turn our attention to the commercial sector. All 3 of you have talked about how important it is to our future. And yet there are still questions, I think, in terms of, how aligned are we in terms of commercial objectives, government objectives, commercial investors, what they want out of it, what government wants out of it. We have 2 audience questions that I'm going to kind of throw in here too. So I'd really like to understand, some of folks in our audience would like to know, are there trends in the space investment domain that are going to impact our future? As tech hiring is slowing, I think we're seeing that in some parts of the sector. Is that going to impact us? Are the technical challenges, the investment, the workforce challenges? What do you see as we continue to rely on the commercial sector to provide those innovative ideas? Are we in the right spot? Do we need to make some changes as to how we motivate and reward the commercial sector with government type contracts? So I think maybe Bucky, I'll start with you. I think this is your area of expertise, and then go to General Olson and then to Colonel Felt.
Well, I'm in California, and so and aerospace has always been strong here. But I was at a forum with Governor Gavin Newsom just a few months ago, where he said that the aerospace industry is larger than the agriculture and entertainment industry combined, and that's huge. I mean, agriculture has always been a juggernaut here by itself, and so. And I think this is a new reality in terms of the potential of this sector, number of people being employed. I think this is really good news for NDIA because there's a growing number of people out there that would benefit from having some affiliation with organizations like this. So it's what's nice is that there are people from outside of the defense sector, outside of NASA, are seeing that there's a growing economy, and actually what's interesting now is how do we grow it in a way that's sustainable, and what that means is we need strong revenue-based businesses. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about this. We pontificate about this a little bit in a report, in that we see one of the strongest things, and we're kind of doubling down on right now, is the hybrid space architecture, which think of it as the Internet of Things in space. What will connect all these satellites and systems? It's digital infrastructure, and digital infrastructure on the terrestrial sphere is the foundation for a very large segment of our economy with the internet. And commercial internet contributes something like 10% of our GDP. So there is no internet of space, and we need it. And what it's going to do is not just from a national security standpoint, but economically, and that's going to be the foundation for many new businesses that are already funded and putting things in space today. We're collaborating between our department and NASA. NASA's LunaNet, which will support Artemis, is going to be an extension of the hybrid space architecture. So we're talking about connectivity that's going to go not just in LEO, but going all the way to the lunar orbit and maybe on to Mars eventually. So this is an American innovation. It's got some of the a lot of Fortune 500 companies are involved with this because they see this future. So that's one dynamic. The other one is this pivot to sustainable space systems, and in the Space Force is I would say is even in a greater leadership position going forward here than even NASA in terms of the adoption of in-space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing, logistics capabilities. Can we have satellites that are more like cell phone towers in the future, that they're modular and we can upgrade them and maintain their technological relevance closer to the state of the art of technology? You need that, but you have to have in-space logistics infrastructure as well, so that you can have tugs that deliver capability or fuel, commodities to not just to these new commercial space stations, but also to various orbits. And so I think really between the logistics infrastructure, digital infrastructure, these are really going to be the bedrock for a rapidly growing space economy that satisfies real needs, is going to significantly lower the cost. You know, the low Earth orbit economy really took off when launch rates went up and price per kilogram went down. We need to do the same thing to the geo belt, and as soon as we do that, that's going to be an even more transformational thing in terms of the growth of the new space economy.
And those are excellent words, and I'll just build on that. From my perspective, I've had the privilege and opportunity to spend just under a decade at NASA and just under a decade in industry, including commercial space company, plus wearing the cloth of the nation here since 1988. When we look at that nexus, Bucky hit it absolutely right. This has got to be a whole of nation, not a whole of government, but a whole of nation approach. As we look at just under a $400 billion space economy, and I think we set a record for the number of launches. But as we start looking for the range of the future and getting to a cadence of perhaps more than one a day, getting to a 400 launch cadence, that's going to be extraordinary. As we see this going from under a $400 billion economy to perhaps $1 trillion, and as you bring the moon into Earth's economic sphere, the potential is much greater. I do believe that what we've done is we've gone from having less than 2% of the market when NASA kicked off the commercial crew cargo development and commercial crew and cargo contracts. It really stimulated to where we now have 98 or 99% of the world's commercial market, which is truly extraordinary. But I see the next big element is that in space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. And as the White House put out the United States national policy on ISAM, again, in space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing, both the policy, but most importantly, the implementation plan across the interagency. But that's really to stimulate this broad and critical industrial base that is there. And it's not just the space industrial base. This is where we bring all the traditional, the non-traditional, the adjacent elements, because it's all focused on terrestrial benefit here. And leveraging the return on investment, the improvement in quality of life, the economic, the health, and the national security benefits all matriculate out of that. So I think it's really important as we look at that. I think as we look at the role of government, we see ourselves as anchor customers, as stimulants, as looking at indemnification, setting the policies, setting the regulatory environment, setting the international treaty and law elements that are so vital. As we look at this, I mean, the body of international law is really the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 and its amendments. The law of the sea and salvage law, which are well settled law for the world's oceans, which cover 70% of the surface. Now we don't have the same apply in space. So these are part of the broader elements that I think are really encapsulated nicely But significant work is underway. But I think what's being highlighted by the group of 250 plus that gave us inputs is we got to accelerate. We got to bring that into we got to bring that into the fold. I think you're starting to see that reflected. The FCC just announced the desire to spool up a space bureau. I think, as we've talked about, the Department of Commerce, that's another activity. As we've seen the Artemis Accords gaining 2 new African countries. I think that's really important as we look at the whole, all 7 continents, as we look at the broader geostrategic and geopolitical element here. And I think we want to be part of setting those frameworks, those standards to be beneficial to U.S. and allied and partner industry, and to be fertile for the way that we believe, the American values, the rule of law, the international order that follows on that. So I think that's really important. And as we look at this, as we look at the commercial tie-ins, we know the nexus of R&D is in the commercial and industry side, and it's driven by a vibrant and dynamic academic foundational basis. As Bucky said, we are in a global competition here, and we're not winning in all the areas. I think that's really the call to action here. And what we've seen also is, as we look at the sustainability side, as we look at the orbital debris and the planetary defense missions, and of course, NASA's great success with Deep Impact proves out the viability and the capability, and what's more important than protecting all of humanity. But as we look at protecting this planet, it's clear that we've got to get off this planet to do so, and that involves big significant thrust in looking at power production and manufacturing and leveraged use of lunar resources and other resources. And these used to have a snicker factor in the past, but now we've got the technology, now we've got the capability, now we've got the will, now we've got the funding, and I think it's a matter of an existential race and an existential challenge to drive the significant benefits that comes from being a first mover advantage here. So this is what we need to do as a country, what the group identified as is aligned with that North Star, bring it together in a whole of nation approach with unity of command and unity of execution, because we ultimately seek peace and prosperity for all. And this is the mechanism to get there. But we also have to have an integrated deterrence and a protect and defend capability such that we can recognize the very real challenges afforded by this, as we've seen throughout all of history. So that is my thoughts there.
All right, Eric, we've got about 1 minute left, so I think we're going to let you have the last word here.
We'll bring it home. From my perspective, what's so exciting to the Space Force and the space acquisition community about all of this commercial innovation and these commercial technologies are that we can use those to maintain our technology lead and to deter conflict with our competitor. And the way that we're using those is through the National Defense Strategy and the focus on the Secretary of the Air Force's focus on these operational imperatives. That is one of my responsibilities in the office, is to lead our OI #1, which is the Resilient Space Order of Battle initiatives. And I will tell you, I have never in my 25 years seen the department move so much money so fast towards priority things that have been identified through this construct that the Secretary laid out. And so that's exciting, and that creates opportunities for us to go after and harness some of these new technologies that the commercial companies are developing. So that not only do we see a problem that we're trying to get after from the budget perspective, but we see solutions that are going to help us get after that problem and really deliver the kind of capabilities that our warfighters need. And those are coming from all this commercial innovation that's out there. So that's why it's so exciting to the Space Force and to space acquisition, is that we can see where we're going with this, and it's a very bright and exciting future. Thanks.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the panel. I will say that just listening to the three of you, I could listen to you guys for another 3-4 hours. Very exciting. We have the right people in the right positions, to push this forward. Appreciate all your energy, enthusiasm, and really for being on the panel today. So thank you very much. And Mark, back over to you.
Janet, thank you so much. And again, I want to echo thanks to this panel. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thanks to all of you for what you do. Thanks for your leadership and the thoughtfulness with which you put together this report. it's going to have important implications. Okay, so now on the agenda, we've got a 5-minute break as we retool for our second panel, which will be our industry panel. No one go away. You can take a rest stop, go get yourself a cup of coffee, but be back in 5 minutes because the next panel is also going to be an outstanding conversation. So thank you, everyone. We'll be reconvening soon.
Hi, Chris.
We gotta follow up this act, man. This is like the Three Amigos here.
Hey, you know, I think you're up to it. Just saying.
I don't know.
Just saying. Hey, I'm going to do a quick. We're going to get started at 11:02.
Like 30 seconds from now.
All right. So let's see, we've got let's see, Chris is on, Aaron is on. I'm not, is Doc on?
Doc's here.
Ah, perfect. All right. One more minute and we will reconvene. Welcome back to our webinar on the state of the space industrial base. I want to remind everyone that today's webinar is sponsored by Synopsys, Synopsys is a proud NDIA member, leader in electronic design automation tools, intellectual property, DMEA accredited services for aerospace defense government customers. Synopsys is excited to sponsor this webinar and looks forward to partnering with each of you to exceed mission requirements for your next space program. So for panel 2, I want to remind everyone of some administrative details. First, once again, all online attendee lines are muted, but if you have a question during the webinar, you can submit your question in the question and answer box. We will do our best to answer all the questions, although we get a lot of questions, we might not have time to do so. Members of the press, especially, you're welcome to ask your questions, but please identify yourselves with your name and organization. Reminder also, we're recording today's webinar for members who are unable to attend, or if you're listening to this webinar and you want to review some of the material, it will be available to you as well. And within the next few days, we will post the recording to our YouTube channel for your review. With that, I'd like to introduce our industry panelists for session number 2. All of them have distinguished careers. So I'm just going to hit the highlights, because if I went through all their biographies, we would have no time for their remarks, or for that matter, answering the questions that our audience poses. Our panel today consists of, first, Aaron Dunn, who is the Vice President for Strategic Force Programs for the Payload and Ground Systems Division at Northrop Grumman Space Systems. In that role, Aaron leads the Strategic Force Programs organization, who is responsible for providing innovative and affordable sensors to support missile warning, missile defense, technical intelligence, weather sensing capabilities, and the ground elements for these missions. And he supports DoD, NOAA, and NASA. Before that, Aaron held a number of different roles at Northrop Grumman, including serving as Integrated Mission Control Operating Unit Director, earned a bachelor's in electrical engineering from University of California, Santa Cruz, master's in electrical engineering from UCLA. Also joining us is Dr. Richard Doc Klemnicki, President and CEO of Arete Incorporated. Doc has 35 years of experience as a leader in operations, technical program management in both the federal, commercial, technology, and defense markets. He's a retired veteran of the U.S. Air Force, Go Air Force, retiring after 20 years of active duty service in 2005. Doc earned a bachelor's from the U.S. Air Force Academy, MS from Lesley University, and a PhD from the University of Denver. And also joining us is Chris Shank, Vice President and General Manager of Air and Space Programs at Maxar Technologies. Maxar, of course, was referenced in our first panel. As part of the public sector team, Chris manages products, accounts, and service delivery, as well as business development across Maxar's intelligence community and national security customer base. Chris has over 30 years of experience in various leadership roles in the military, U.S. government, commercial industry, including serving as the director of the Strategic Capabilities Office at the DoD. He earned a Master's of Science in Aerospace Engineering from the University of Colorado and a Bachelor's in Mathematics from the University of Notre Dame. So thank you to all of our panelists again for joining us for today's discussion. Now that we've heard from the authors of the DIU Space Report, we're going to turn to you to provide your perspective. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give us just a few minutes of opening remarks, and then we'll dive headfirst into questions. And again, I want to remind our audience, we will do our best to go through as many of your questions as we can. Chris, would you like to start us off? And then we'll go to Doc and then go to Aaron.
Sure. Thanks, Mark, and thanks to the leadership that Bucky Boutou, John Olson, and Colonel Eric Felt have given this nation, especially in work in this report in particular. And there's been a drumbeat over the last several years, on that. I was glad that it was great to listen to the soundtrack compared to the report. I was, in my reading of it, my glass was half empty when I first read the report. And I think it's a matter of whereas I think my glass is more half full after listening to the panel and the general recognition, I think that those of us in the space business feel that we are living in exciting times with the National Space Council, only 3 years old of a Space Force, Space Command, the recent Artemis 1 mission, last year's James Webb Space Telescope, and the amazing discoveries that will provide. Those of us in the national security space of the world, we're not, due to classification, which is one of the barriers to execution on this, that we are working through. is classification. And when you look at what we provide, Maxar provides in terms of commercial intelligence and data analytics and that kind of thing, we are able to talk about that to a certain degree about the support that we're providing to our customers. And a lot of people have learned about Maxar and our capabilities, unfortunately, due to the war in Ukraine and what the Russians have done. When I had a celebratory moment with Matt Mountain, who is one of the people in the Space Telescope Science Institute, who is operating and managing the James Webb Space Telescope, and how flawless that execution went. And yes, Aaron, congrats to Northrop Grumman, on that. I go, your imagery is far more inspiring than perhaps what folks are seeing from our commercial satellite imagery over Ukraine. And he stopped me because he goes, no, Chris, actually what you're doing is more important, because it's literally and figuratively holding up a mirror to the face of evil in our world. And that's an important point to make. And so as the report reflects the need for a national vision, I think that's the kind of compelling discussion that we need to be having, because many of us can't talk about openly too much to excite people and inspire people of what is going on in the national security space environment. Some of the questions from the last panel was about with the downturn in the tech industry. Actually, because of our name recognition, we are having a bounty of resumes coming our way, and we have a lot of open job recs. Business is going really well, and so that we're going to need that talent. So when I looked at the report and listened to the soundtrack here around it, as Bucky mentioned, we've been to the AA meeting, and I think as we're working down the recognizing the problem, we're now addressing the problem. And that in working that, there's big rocks, medium rocks, and sand in the gears on barriers to execution. And I think that we're working through this, but I got to recognize the leadership that has been shown, not just with this report, but also Secretary Kendall's operational imperatives, especially as it gets to space battle management, tactical ISR, that kind of thing, as well as with Secretary Calvelli's tenets as well. I think we're going in the right direction, and so it's just a matter of getting on it. So I'll stop there.
Chris, thank you so much. Doc, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Those are great comments. Excuse me. So I'll just start with a throat clearing. Short blurb about me. As I mentioned, I was born on a military base in a foreign country and retired from the Air Force at the age of 42. So I had two 20-year periods there, a 2-decade period as a military brat and a 2-decade period as a brat in the military. Constantly trying to evolve my thoughts, is this glass half full or half empty? I've added another 2 decades in the defense industry base, and I still have that same question, Chris. Is it half empty, half full? And these reports are very important in trying to find out historically, where were we going? Is it the right direction? And so you do have to call out the glass as being half empty when you start there, so that you can get to the half full. And so one of the things that I mentioned, those 3 phases, we have to be really careful with our assumptions when we talk about the defense industry base. And by that, I mean, when I was a dependent, I looked at what my father was doing as an active duty officer differently than how I looked at that work when I became an officer. And I look at it differently again when I'm trying to provide a product or service to the DoD. A backstory. So I started out in space in the 1970s, early 70s. My father was at RAF Mildenhall, and he invited both my brother and I to come to his weather detachment. And so we could look at photographs, right? Weather satellite photographs. By the way, that was also my start in science, because meteorologists, they'll describe weather as about the transfer of energy through the atmosphere, and that water is the most common medium for that energy transfer. So he's showing me pictures, and there's water, water vapor. And then he showed me a couple pictures that these weather satellites took, and there was no water vapor. And I thought, why bother taking a picture? That's the dependent mindset. Fast forward, I'm on active duty, and now I understood why we took pictures when there weren't clouds. So that perspective is where you start looking at how do you change your focus. And I think it also helps us kind of in an allegory, roll back the fog on what it is that we're trying to look at. And so for me, first and foremost, the space market is kind of a broad term, and I think we need to look at it differently. The report calls out a number of different areas. And I think if we understand the space market in a broader sense, on orbit, assured access, ground stations, those are three just broad general ways of looking at it. We'll see that what's good in assured access may or may not be good in ground station and vice versa. But if you have an improvement in ground station, do you likewise also have a subsequent enhancement and on orbit? Well, not necessarily so, but the broader space market you do. And so that's one of the cautions I have when we look at these things is that you got to look at the focus area of what it is you're trying to resolve. And so, the industries, for example, when we look at what's come out of the Webb telescope, we now are questioning some scientific facts that we have held for a very long time. And so as scientists, we need to recognize that science is about continually questioning what's going on and not coming down to the standard firm belief system. However, industry has to base itself, forecast what it's going to do on some of those belief systems, and those will change. Space Systems Command now has 5 PEOs. Those 5 PEOs provide some really specific focus areas that integrated together come up with a space mission, but those are at an operational and tactical level. So we're going to talk later about how do you inform a strategic vision. One way is by what you're currently doing and determining whether or not it's the right path or not. But I also think we need to look at this in an inclusive sort of way. When you take these individual components, are they working well together? And so that allows you to build a broader space vision when you can focus on a specific issue point and resolve it or mitigate it and then enhance it. So for example, if you're driving a car, hey, but your tire goes flat. Well, you need to fix the tire. Is the tire part of the total car, part of the total travel? Yes, but who knows how to change a tire? So those kinds of simple ideas. And then again, if you're on a family trip, I look at that more like as in a personal way. So like I said, my personal start in space was really with the lunar landing. My brother and I sitting there watching it on television, and that was fascinating. My parents photographed it, so of course that's in everybody's books. But that personal story is something we need to look at as well between DoD and the defense industry base. And we have programs like education with industry, right? And I think that's someplace where we could start looking at perhaps increasing the number of folks that go. Because for example, the Honorable Frank Kendall stated that profit is the reason that firms we rely upon exist, and we should not use profit as a cost-cutting measure, but we should not allow for excessive profit, nor should it flow regardless of performance. So I think that's a real balanced approach between recognizing what it is the DIB does and how it's motivated, and what DoD does and how it's motivated. And it's the people that work between those two motives that need to have a shared taxonomy. And something like EWI, if we could send more officers and enlisted to EWI, I think we would begin to understand better and talk in terms that the defense industry would understand, and also think more like that, so that we could call out for better requirements and a greater understanding on how a contract would be measured, CLINs, sub-CLINs, profits, types, et cetera. So that's my call, is that let's take the fog off of this broad space market and look at its component parts and see what's working and continue to do that and what isn't and fix it. And secondly, develop those personal relationships, again, through these kinds of encounters, but also through programs like EWI.
Doc, thanks a lot. Aaron, over to you.
Mark, thank you. Yeah, first off, I just want to thank the earlier panel. I agree with the Doc and Chris on with me. It was truly motivating to hear that, from some of our senior leaders, our customers, on how they're looking at the problem, because it's similar things that we're contending with. as I, prepared for this after reviewing the report, three things really jumped out at me. And I think they came out in the earlier discussion, was really this need for this vision, this North Star vision. And I think that's really centering for our industry. It allows us to plan and invest. And with that investment, we can build partnerships, right? I mean, we're partnering, looking at the hybrid space architectures, how we can work with commercial companies, leverage that into these national defense space programs, so we can get better leverage and bring capabilities faster to the fight and to the needs of our nation. And then also, I'll bring back at the end, it comes down to the people, right? I mean, exciting our people. And I see things like, James Webb, of course, has been mentioned a few times, Artemis, that's exciting. I was excited. I'm waking up early. I was on travel somewhere, sitting in bed, watching Artemis go. And that's exciting for me. I tell my children about that. And right, it can be difficult for those that are, firmly in the defense space to talk about what we do. But when I meet with engineers, young engineers, folks that are assessing joining this industry, I get them excited because I say, we're working on really hard problems. It's exciting missions. And it's a very fulfilling mission, right? So, with that, I'll just say I'm really excited for the panel in this discussion, and I'm excited to get to the questions. So let's get to it. Thank you.
Very good. So, hey, let me start up. We already have a question from the audience. So let me start with that question before we go through some of the questions that I have. The question is, what are the technical challenges of providing commercial services and assets to the Department of Defense? And will standard vendor interoperability, greater digitalization help address these challenges? Who wants to grab that one?
I'll take some of it on. I mean, this is it's a sandwich. It takes a bite. I'm not saying what kind of sandwich it is, but because I worked with John Olson. Gosh darn, what was that? 16 years ago now. When we were both at NASA together on the commercial crew and cargo program. And a lot of it is, building a comfort level with customers to be willing and able to take a certain level of risk on this. And it's, some limited stakes betting. I am fully embrace where, so now fast forward where we are today on, buy what we can and build what we must. That is a conversation. That is a dynamic conversation that depends on the mission area. Is there a commercial market for it? For example, what we do at Maxar we sell imagery and data analytics to the United States government, various agencies, as well as international partners, as well as commercial. So this is your Google Maps, Apple, etc. That kind of thing. So that there is other people paying for those satellites, and our next generation satellites are going up, starting to go up here just in a couple months. So this is the kind of thing where it's a dynamic conversation on risk tolerance with customers. So that that's how we'll get there. I think the government, because of the scars that were born earlier, are now willing to address this whole data as a service discussion, for this. And this is where we've pioneered this in the imagery business. Next is synthetic aperture radar, RF, etc. We can work down, but you can have these kind of there's a willingness now amongst the government to have these conversations in several areas. And that's what's exciting to me.
So is industry though looking for standards to enable better interaction with government partners, or seeking interoperability? Is that?
Yeah. So I apologize on the technical aspects. It kind of depends on what is the type of data format that you want to receive the data into, for example. I remember in working with the space station is ensuring the docking, the rendezvous proxops docking, and those are active and good discussions kind of things.
Yeah, of course, there's a downside to standard that you've got the wrong standards.
Well, I'm in.
Yeah, Doc, you want to jump in?
And there's a problem in this regard. It comes to LaserCom, by the way. I just want to say that we've got to work through that on LaserCom.
Yeah. Well, talking to working through, right, and then backdrop to my weather background, right? When you look at the most recent effort by Department of Defense in the as a service effort was weather as a service. And PO came out just a couple days ago, you saw in the news there, that they're not going to be able to get to that point by the time frame that they want to get to. So I think also as we start looking at some of these technical requirements and technical capabilities, again, if you have a more shared taxonomy, you won't look at this and say, you produce data, we need data, therefore we're good, right? It's not quite that clean of a connection. And so I think if we start looking at these requirements in a more shared way, because you're doing it as a service, and the development of some of those requirements in a more shared form, and that becomes problematic because the DoD just does not have as much time to sit down regularly with a large group, except through forums like what we're providing here through NDIA and whatnot. And so to be able to take advantage of those opportunities where we talk openly about requirements, about the glass half full, glass half empty viewpoints, and then the baseline there between the two. And you'll find that there are some great ways that it's working. The UDL, out here in Colorado Springs, that was a great contract and it's a great effort to go digital. But again, as Chris pointed out, some of those problems are, I have to compartment you. So I can't talk to you about all my requirements. And what kind of photographs are you, imagery are you looking for? And what other kinds of sensor data are you looking for from weather as a service? And how are the weather requirements for combat operations, warfighting, different than the non-warfighting environment? And so we'll work through that, but I think it's worth watching to see how they solve this weather as a service problem, because I think it will inform future as a service efforts.
Aaron?
Yeah, I think standards and interoperability can definitely help. I don't view it as necessarily a panacea. I think there's various layers to this, right? As a payload provider, I'm looking for standard bus interface, electronic, mechanical interfaces. On the ground side, it's a challenge with getting data interoperability and the standards there. I can think back to earlier in my career working on the airborne side when OMS started coming out, and it wasn't. It helped greatly because it allowed us to, at least from the start, we were saying the same words, maybe not always meaning the same thing, but even with that, it helped with quickening that integration, right? And so we could get together with partners as part of that consortium and do these test and integrate. And so I think there is an opportunity to do that at the data levels, particularly as we look at taking maybe what DoD and IC data and merging it with things that may come from CRIS or other commercial providers. Having that level of interoperability, I think, really helps. But I also am hesitant because we don't want to limit innovation, right? I think standards can become prescriptive, and so I think there's a balance there.
So that's a good lead into the next question, which is, in the first panel we had some discussion about barriers barriers to the government successfully articulating a national vision and executing. What barriers do you all see that are keeping the U.S. government from articulating a national vision, or once articulating that vision, producing meaningful strategic level guidance, and ultimately providing a demand signal?
If you don't mind, go ahead.
Yeah, please, Doc.
Yeah, so I kind of look at this differently. I think that the barriers are also the demand signal. And by that, I mean, if you go back to 2000, you'll see that each of the different administrations had a space vision. And where the difficulty came in, it was in the funding. So the barrier is, it's an endemic and systemic issue associated with our open form of government. And that's an observation, not a castigation, okay? But that also leads to the clear demand signal. So for example, between 2000 and 2008, we had the Challenger incident. And our space vision was to try and extend our interest in space and human exploration and get people excited about space again. Their feeling was that we weren't excited. From 2008 to 2016, the start of that administration faced some really severe economic woes. So it had to cut back on some of the programs, but it wanted to continue to build relationships, specifically international relationships. So now you've got this crescendo happening. The next administration came out with its policy. It had policy letters as well that were very operationally focused, that gave very specific outcomes that it was seeking. And then the most recent one is called the Space Priorities Framework. And they're not really changing anything. All they're doing is adding climate change to the list of things that they want to look at. International relationships, key amongst those. And so I think what you start seeing is that the relationships that are presented as ways to mitigate these barriers are forming the demand signal. As we interact with each other, we find out what our strengths and weaknesses are. As our relationships develop more, we have more trustful interchanges. As those trustful interchanges happen, we can expose some of our issues, like we have a flat tire, using the car analogy earlier. And so I think that if we look at the barriers, not just as a barrier, but also as the demand signal, we can begin to start looking at different things. Take cybersecurity, for example, right? When we talk about standards, do you want to have the same CMMC and NIST standards on a ground station as you do on a launch vehicle, as you do on an on-orbit asset? You know, recently there were some looks at the NIST standards, and they said we don't need all of those on an on-orbit asset. It's not terrestrial. So when we start talking about these standards, how do they fluctuate throughout the entirety of the space industry base? And how does a strategic vision allow for that flexibility? And how do you then fund those flexible approaches to a broader market when you're trying to be collaborative by looking at component parts at each of those 5 PEOs? Again, it comes down to relationships.
Very good. Anyone else on barrier?
Well, I wanted to comment just because of
Yep.
I wanted to hear Doc because I'd spent, prior to coming to Maxar, 10 years on Capitol Hill. So I've heard a lot of speeches in my life on it, and perhaps some of them aren't all that practical in that regard. So what I've found is necessary when articulating vision is it has to be compelling. There has to be buy-in, from multiple sources. So this is not a bureaucratic speech. This is not a report that sits on a shelf kind of thing. It's how do you communicate a compelling vision? Is Mark used to be the Air Force chief scientist. So in the Air Force, it's fly, fight, win, right? Mm-hmm. So I think there's an element that Space Force will need to articulate a similar essence, if you will, I hate to say this, but it is a bumper sticker, right? That we can all memorize and keep in our heads, and that is our North Star. So it's not lengthy in terms of compelling. And then you have to be persistent about it. You have to communicate it, and you got to be persistent about it, in terms of building the rhythm up. And then I think really where Doc was coming from and where we're coming from on industry is results matter. Is the compelling means that the funding will be there, and we at an engineering level that we are providing results for our the U.S. government as well as the larger economic sphere, that we're providing that in a timely manner, in an efficient manner for them. And if there's delays, it's not good for the rest of us in this business. So that's my 2 cents on that discussion.
Great.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Mark, I was just going to add, I think just to touch on an additional barrier that I see at times is, there's a handful of government organizations that are pursuing, various objectives in space, and at times they can be competing and not intentionally competing. They may not know what the other organizations are doing, and they may not be able to know because of security constraints. So I see that as something that can be a challenge, informing our customers or trying to balance these priorities. And another side of it is it's not just the U.S., right? I mean, we fight as a coalition. We're not the only ones driving this economy. So having that global vision, I think, is going to. But with this clear demand signal, again, it will provide. I'd say strengthen our investments and understanding and being able to prioritize what we're doing. And I think that will reach across into the commercial area and, with VCs and private equity as well, when they can see where this market is going and where this vision is going. So I think it's a really important, area that was identified in the report and really would provide some stability as we move forward.
Aaron, I think that's a great point. I can cite examples where industry was actually the bridge between different government agencies. So I think that point is very well taken.
It's an awkward dance.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, from both sides. Let me shift gears a little bit. You know, Chris, you talked about delivery. Investments in the U.S. based industrial base have clearly grown significantly, especially in the last 5 years. But the U.S. supply chains for space maybe haven't always been able to meet the demand. So how does the U.S. accelerate domestic manufacturing, strengthen supply chains in order to ensure that it keeps up with the demand for the delivery of the space industrial base?
Yeah, this is, the supply chain issues, anybody who's been working in business or see, last Christmas wasn't so bad, but the previous Christmas before that, in terms of trying to get the toy that you needed. But this is, we are part of that larger, ecosystem on this. And as Bucky pointed out, economic security is national security. So yes, we are, looking at supply chains on this, and the government is as well, at more of the macro level of, what are, critical technologies. A lot of this was in the recent CHIPS Act, for that, which will have, significant repercussions for, in the silicon chip world, that has for the automotive industry and a lot of other industries, that are higher than space is. I have to say though, on the supply chain for workforce, I just need to comment on that one. That is, for me, that is our most precious supply chain, for this is the critical talent. And so we're hiring. Come join us.
Aaron, Doc, either of you have comments about supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, I'll agree with a lot of Chris's points. The past couple of years, we've learned a lot. I think it's also been, exciting to see how we've innovated with our customers and to address these hard problems, or with our partners, right? I've worked with my prime teams to look for parts that we've needed to deliver the payload to them at times, and we've been able to do that and transfer that material. So working with our customers as well. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I think this vision is really going to be key to it, right? We're willing to invest. We have invested. We'll invest in our suppliers to ensure that we have the right capabilities and we have the right number of sources to do that. But that's a hard decision to make if we're uncertain on the funding, or when a program will start, or how fungible this thing I may buy ahead of time will be, given a changing direction or a changing priority. But and then the people are huge ones. I think we can collectively, one of these of our defense contractors, our space contractors, we have thousands of opportunities, and we're seeing a bit of a shift in the job market, and I think that's helping. Last year was definitely a challenge, but I think the people aspects beyond just the the hardware, the technical, the supply chain is really going to be critical to us delivering and being able to stay ahead in this fight.
Mm-hmm.
I think also recognizing a couple of factors, and we can use China as a comparison, right? When you start looking at the share of global manufacturing goods for China over the last 20 years, it went from 12% to 27%, while the U.S. dropped from 19 to 17%. And Bucky talked about health checks, right? So I think when we do a health check of our supply chain, we have to really look at where were we getting most of our products and how are we getting them? And was that the right way to get them? And are there protections that we can put into it? And so there was a comment also about the growth of China in the earlier panel. I'm not quite in that same camp in one sense. And that is that the education of the Chinese engineers is through American institutions, but they have to return to a closed central planning system. And so their innovations are stifled. The United States is the most innovative character in the market. We have an open system. It's capitalistic in nature, And so when we start looking at supply chain, we can actually look at it and say, what are the problems and address mitigations. In those kinds of countries like China, which dominate, say, rare earth metals, they just stay track with their party policies. The United States, on the other hand, recognized that China was taking over the rare earth metal industries and was at 0% of rare earth metals relative, point something, but zero for all intents and purposes. We're now at 8%. So that's the flexibility that's associated with these supply chains, is that as you notice them, an open system like the United States can direct its forces where it needs to. I shouldn't use the word forces. I don't mean that they're Space Force forces, but rather our commercial industry-based forces, our resources and our requirements. And we can also have influence on what is taught in academia. At the University of Colorado Springs, they have a new degree. It's not a Bachelor of Science, it's a Bachelor of Innovation, a BI, where it's half engineering and half business marketing. So that's another way that you start looking at supply chain, is with a different focus on it. And I think that the system that we have in place is going to be very adept at doing that. But in the interim, we're almost always going to be a little behind, because if it ain't broke, you don't fix it. So you have to identify where are the cracks, where are the crevices, where is it broken? And that, again, is really a great place for these kinds of reports in this kind of a forum.
So Doc, you mentioned China, and of course there was some mention of China in the previous panel as well. And when I think it's fair to say, Chris, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but certainly when I was back in the Pentagon, it was China, China, China. Every day it was, what is China doing? So with that in mind, the reality is China is ramping up their S&T activities. By some estimates, they're actually expected to surpass our investments in S&T by 2030. I'd argue that's not as dire as it sounds, because when we add in our friends, partners, and allies, we still swamp what the Chinese are doing. But yet, still, the Chinese investments are extensive across areas, and especially in space. So, as this gap in investment between the U.S. and China is closing, maybe flipping in the wrong direction, I'd like to ask you, what would you like to see the U.S. do to maintain its leadership in global research and development, especially focused in the space domain? Aaron, do you want to start with that one, and we'll go back to the other panel members?
Sure. Yeah, Mark, I mean, you touched on it a bit. I think taking a broader view around the international alliances are really important, right? Science and technology, the research we do crosses borders, and I think ability to allow us to, better work with our international allies on our defense intelligence program, some of these space programs, and that's not always classification. There's ITAR restrictions. There's other things that can hold back some of that. I think that can really allow us to generate greater leverage, right, with our like-minded allies and nation states. So I don't see it as we have to outpace China by ourselves. It's going to be a challenge, and it's going to go back to the people as well, right? I mean, the U.S. has about 20% of our threat nation's population, so it's going to really be important for us to, show that you can have an exciting career where you can really make a difference, right? I meet people that talk about startups make a difference. I go, you really want to make a difference? Come join Northrop or join Maxar or Lockheed or Boeing, because we're working on really hard problems that truly impact the world. We can't always talk about it, but that's really important. And then we just have to be, cognizant of managing international reliances. I think, Chris, you brought up the CHIP Act. I think we saw a lot of that during COVID. It was a different complicating factor of that. Some of these foundries, these chips that surprised us in the supply chain, things that we could get a couple of years ago, relatively quickly, had extremely long lead times, and we had to, react and adjust to that. So those are some of the key areas. I think really leveraging our international partners, alliances, allies, and also looking at our people and how do we grow that talent.
I could add on to what Aaron said there, not just Northrop Grumman, Maxar, and Lockheed Martin, but hire companies like Arity, who come in with real specific skill sets and niche that'll help you, and you get a broader picture. So there's the sales pitch. But I really like how you're talking about the international. So the European Space Agency, and I agree, it's not just SCI issues, right? But one of the more recent conversations with U.S. Space Command has been that their Five Eyes partners are like, can we move from no foreign to yes foreign and do more open sharing? And I know John Hyten took that on. Oh, I mean, his 60 Minutes piece was key to that. And I just spoke to him a couple months ago about the same topic. And he feels like we're moving in the right direction, but we're not there. So if there's a way we can really look at how we get the SCI and the no foreign to yes foreign broken down, I think that'd be great. I think the other thing too, when we start looking at it, is if we're going to compare ourselves to China, we need to do it on an apples to apples, not an apples to orange. Again, like I said, the CCP is a closed central planning type economy with compliance with party directives and government control. The US is open, decentralized, transparent, based on competition. When you look at those two, it's a very different way of saying, like Chris was saying, the way that the Hill operates is not at all like the CCP operates. So you have to recognize how they operate differently. Secondly, their education systems. Not just are they sending their engineers over here and then sending them back, they're stealing intellectual property. And their education system is based on rote memorization, whereas the American is based on early memorization, then moving to critical thinking. And so they're going to be stuck in an environment where they can only show what they've memorized and what they stole. And so I caution against trying to compete with China on its field. Rather, the United States sets a set of standards that we want to meet, and we have those conversations with our international partners. We set those standards and then we go for them. If the outcome is that China falls off the stage because we did such an excellent job and they have been a threat, great. But if we continually focus on what they're doing, we're not going to focus on what we need to do. And I think that's how we can change the pace between China and the United States.
Chris, any thoughts?
Wow, I have to follow up Doc and Aaron on this. Okay,
Yeah.
so let me.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do.
Hey, so Mark, you're absolutely right. It was, when we were in the Pentagon together, it was China, and Russia, by the way. In
Yeah,
terms of
yeah,
if you
yeah,
read
a little
the
bit of Russia.
national defense strategy on that. Don't, because that's the crazy uncle, unfortunately, that got crazier. And I'm paraphrasing Major General Greg Gagnon on that, if you haven't heard him talk about that. So Doc is exactly right. American ingenuity is how we're going to win. I'm not going to ascribe to linear projections on spending curves. Sometimes it's not about the spending on things. As we've applied commercial practices to defense problems and IC problems, national security space problems, our commercial guys have looked at software, for example, and said, why is this costing so much? This shouldn't cost this much. We can do this for order of magnitude, 2 orders of magnitude cheaper. And actually, we demonstrated that. I can't talk about it due to classification purposes, but once we demonstrated that, the customer then said, we want the community to recognize the changes that we're making here, for this. So in this, commercial space, sometimes that, I mean, in terms of our use of language, Maxar used to be called non-traditional, right? Non-traditional. When I first walked into Space Systems Command as a Maxar guy. So there's that American ingenuity and then American teamwork. The other observation that Greg Gagnon made, which I thought was, he goes, I've never gone to war in my career without an Aussie and a Brit right next to me, on that. So, and we expand that. We know how to work coalition. And so to the discussion earlier on standards, it's our ability to do the joint and coalition, all domain command and control, our ability to talk to each other, to share imagery. And that is one of the things that Maxar imagery and analytics can provide. Actually, even unfortunately, John Olson had to move on, but the eye-watering capabilities from artificial intelligence that our imagery analysts would not have, they would have taken a look at a cloudy picture that Doc was talking about earlier and said, oh, this picture is garbage. It's full of clouds. I can't see the airfield underneath it. We applied artificial intelligence to that and it started picking out a number of them. So this is the kind of thing, it doesn't take, we're going to have to out innovate this. This isn't going to be, sometimes it's 5 yards in a cloud of dust. And sometimes it's the aha moment. I can do this faster and cheaper. approach. So.
Yeah, and Mark, can I just add one thing? I think
Go for
Doc,
it.
you brought some really good points, and Chris followed on to them. But that the ability for us to continue to innovate and continue to invest and exploit what we have, to use one of the General Gutlein's tenets. You know, we've seen great innovation where we may launch a system thinking it's going to do one thing or thinking it's going to be able to provide this capability, and using AI, ML, advanced processing, realize that, oh, we can do this too, and we can do that too. And I think that ability and allowing industry, you know, I'm not going to call it non-traditional or traditional, just industry, to innovate on our programs and understand and bring these things to our customers. And we've seen that in operations, and it's really exciting when we're able to let our engineers loose and let our innovators loose against these hard problems, these hard challenges, without being prescriptive. So thanks for that.
Yeah,
Doc.
no, I like to point out that the vast majority of international students who study in a country other than their own come to the United States. And I've also argued if that ever flips, if they start going to China, that's when we've really lost it. And you know, Doc, to your point, the vast majority of Chinese students who do come to the United States want to stay here. Probably some for bad reasons, but the vast majority, I think, they come to the United States, they enjoy our freedoms, the spirit of innovation, and they want to be a part of that. So that speaks well. My next question was I'm gonna tee up the next question, although we basically already started to answer it. I think, Chris, you kind of alluded to this, and that was going to be how can the U.S. government, and especially the Department of Defense, better leverage commercial space technology in order to retain its leadership position, specifically in the competition with China?
Yeah, actually, Bucky Buteau, you really hit on this.
Yeah.
I think there's going to be it's a discussion, okay, in terms of how we're going to get there, for that. I cannot point to a single program where like this is it. There is some discussions, hopefully, for us that we're looking at for tactical ISR, in this, and the use of commercial capabilities for that. That's beyond what in terms of the timeliness of the data, that's beyond what National Reconnaissance Office has contracted for us, and that is a DoD hard requirement. To the previous discussion about the JROC type requirements, is like, no, that timeliness of targeting information is going to be coming in that space, which is also gets into a larger discussion of the JADC2, the overall architecture for communications on this, those kinds of things. The other thing on commercial, I have to say, there's a lot of and maybe Doc can expand on this some more, is in space domain awareness. There is a lot of commercial providers in this that are bringing a lot of innovative ideas and approaches, to that, of which we are also hoping to, be part of an integration on that, because that's how when it comes to fusing data together, and I think you've seen, folks have seen Maxar can start selling what we call non-Earth imaging of other folks' satellites for characterization purposes, that kind of thing, on a commercial market. We've been a recent NOAA license for that. That was based off of many years of hard conversations and building trust, for that. So I think this is where we're going to be heading in the course of the next couple of years.
Doc, Aaron, either of you want to?
Yeah, I would say also I'm hesitant to use. I mean, I know we're trying to leverage on how we can enhance our position versus China, and I get that China is the big beast there, but I would caution against, again, focusing on what it is that China's doing and how we can do it versus what is it that we want to do. So, for example, when we started talking earlier about the health checks that Bucky was talking about, and then we also talked about the number of launches. I'm not so sure that number of launches is always the right metric. For example, if 60% of your launches are to, say, replace a SBIRS, or a large asset in space that has a replica in a storehouse somewhere that has been built and sitting for a number of periods of whatever you're counting in periods of time, that's not innovation. That's operations, maintenance, and sustainment. So if it's to leverage our position, I think we need to start looking at what are the metrics of interest that we're using, and how are we then moving those forward. So as Chris was saying, what are different ways that we're applying commercial to government needs? What are, and as Aaron was talking about earlier, how are we getting ahead of the power curve on some of these things with those innovations at a corporate and at an academic level? I think then we also need to look at how are we going to measure success? That seems to always be the question that you end up asking halfway through the beginning conversation about what are we going to do next? And someone goes, what's our end result look like? And so if you start with that question and you start applying those metrics from that viewpoint, you'll find that both what Chris and Aaron are saying dovetail nicely. And again, it's without regard to what China is doing, rather it's with regard to what the United States and its allied partners want to accomplish, will accomplish, and that will force China to have to follow toe. And to your point, Mark, that kind of an approach is endearing to those young folks that are coming from China over. So yes, there's nefarious reasons for sticking around, but there's real legitimate personal freedom, innovation, expression, ideas, and those are all personal relationships that you can develop. And again, I still say personal develops with EWE, getting DoD to live a year in the shoes of the DIB, so that it can then make requirements that will enable the United States to really just, with its allied partners, outgrow the Chinese threat.
Right. So we've got only a few minutes remaining, and I want to pick up on a point. You know, NDIA has about 1,800 member companies. The vast majority of them are mid-sized or small companies. We've got a very, very active small business division. I want to focus in, are there better ways for the U.S. government to engage with small businesses? And if so, what vehicles do you think are the best ways to do so?
Well, as a small business owner,
I was hoping you'd jump in.
okay, so it's great to have relationships with the largest and to be a subcontractor. All right, it's a chance to show your niche, but you lack self-determination as a sub. And so any efforts that you have to grow the small businesses has to rely on self-determination aspects. Small business plans are nice, but more towards the where and when can you use a small business? And so partnerships are important, joint ventures are important. Those all help grow the small business. There's a number of vehicles where there are specific set-asides. I think the determination for a set-aside, especially economic determination, disadvantage, sorry. Those are also key to what we're doing. And we're seeing some of the larger contracts, something like Oasis Plus is now different than Oasis in that it has 9 contracts in 7 different areas from which you can compete as a corporate size. So I think focusing on those kinds of opportunities for smalls to have self-determination and not deter the largest from continuing to bring smalls into the fold.
So Chris, you know, Maxar, I think is quite an example of a success there. I think you've got like almost 4,500 employees now and close to $2 billion in business. But you also, Maxar started as a small business. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna also pass that over to you. What are the better ways for the government to engage with small businesses so other businesses can be as successful as Maxar?
Yeah, so having that's part of the DNA. And Walter Scott, who started Digital Globe back in 1992, et cetera, talks about that. Talks about the need for us as well in recognizing the perspective of a small business and what it is they're trying to do. And then is there a culture fit? Whether it's we are also a part of mergers and acquisition. A lot of M&A doesn't work, okay? And it has been able to work within Maxar because we have culture fit discussions. Is there an alignment, between that? And as well as when we work, when we try to build a team, for, on things, it's okay, these are the skill sets, et cetera. But having that conversation up front with a small company is important because we don't want this to be simply a transactional relationship. It's hey, we think if we grow, this together and this together, we can go for the next rung and build ourselves up through the value chain on these things.
Right.
So it's and those are deep, meaningful conversations of where it is somebody wants to go or not go, right? And who you partner with.
Yeah.
Is that helpful, Doc?
Yes.
Is that
Okay.
am I missing?
No, I agree. And I would say too, and I don't want to take from Aaron's time, but there are a number of mentoring programs where the larges really do help, because people get this idea that a small business is just a scaled down version. No, they're completely different. When you start out, your CEO, HR, CFO, you're all the C-suite in one, and you're the product. So as you grow, you have to learn how to divest that, and the larges will teach you how to do that better, so that you don't fail as you grow.
Aaron, I'm going to give you the last word, even though Northrop Grumman is clearly not a small business by any stretch of the imagination, but you obviously work with a suite of small businesses.
Yeah,
Observations on engagement with small businesses.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, I don't have much to add, but I would just say, Doc, always incredibly impressed, with the smalls that I've worked with. I'm familiar with, I think I know where you're located down with the UDL and some of the partners out there. And so, anything we can help, I always try to be as honest as possible and open as I can with our smalls to help, provide them as much information they can so they're making the right choices. And I agree, I don't want the smalls to be Northrop Grumman. I want them because they're different, right? And the value they bring by being different. So thank you.
Great. I'm going to make that the last word for the panel. Unfortunately, our time has run out. We could go for another hour with this panel. I've really been enjoying this discussion. Number of folks to thank. Once again, I want to thank Synopsys for sponsoring this webinar. We really appreciate the support. I want to thank our panel members, both this morning, our first panel and this industry panel. I've really enjoyed this conversation and this exchange. Also want to express some thanks to NDIA's Space Division, who helped assemble this event, and also to the staff here at ETI, including Rebecca Wilsonberg, who was our lead on ETI in putting this together, Camila Shanley, and Daniel Park, who's been off camera, making sure I don't completely embarrass myself. If I could, a little bit of unabashed advertisement. We've got some upcoming events that I want to make you all aware of. On January 26th, we will be presenting a workshop on Digital Engineering 101. It's one in the series that ETI has been doing to educate our members on various aspects of the emerging technologies. This will be presented by Dinesh Verma, who is the Executive Director of Systems Engineering Research at Stevens Institute. February 23rd, we're going to be doing Systems Engineering 101. That'll be at 1 p.m. and it'll be presented by Jim Faist, who's a friend who worked with both Chris and myself in the Pentagon. But the big announcement is August 28th through 30th, we will be putting on the Emerging Technologies Conference and Exhibition. That'll be the Emerging Technology Institute's first big event of its type. We're going to hopefully pull the whole emerging technologies community together to focus on the critical issues relevant to delivering emerging technologies to national defense. And with that, let me once again thank our panelists, thank our attendees, thank all of our participants, thank our sponsors. I want to remind you that we will post the recording online as soon as it's available. If you have feedback on this or other ETI events, please feel free to email us at eti@ndia.org. And with that, thank you again for your participation and have a good rest of the day.